in the year 2008. Madam is member of NMC expert group for revision of curriculum for MD in pharmacology and nominated and currently participating in the FEMER competency education project for training faculty for the CBME. Madam is also Secretary International Indian Pharmacology Society since 2019, and Madam was also the Chief Editor of Indian Journal of Pharmacology from 2013 to 17. She was also Associate Editor of the Indian Journal of Pharmacology from 2006 to 12. Madam has also received 3 awards, namely Dr. P.K. Carr Memorial Oration in 2014, N.N. Datta Prize for the Best Published Paper in 2015, and Dr. S.C. Verma Memorial Prize twice for the Best Paper Presentation at Gujarat State Level Conference of Indian Pharmacology Society, Ahmedabad branch. Now I request Punnagi Madam to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Mudalini Kadikar. Over to Dr. Punnagi Madam.
Thank you, sir, for the nice introduction. And I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Mrinalini Kadikar. She's presently working as Associate Professor Pharmacology and Member Secretary of Institutional Ethics Committee of Government Medical College, Nagpur. And she is also member of Subject Expert Committee of DCGI, New Delhi. And she's member of Forum of Ethics Review Committee of India and member of Ethics Council of Indian Society of Clinical Research. She is also trained by NABH on GCP and NDCT and has many publications, more than 45 publications in various national and international journals. And she has been faculty for GCP workshop, and she has also organized many training workshops on GCP and recently received Hall of Fame Award from ISCR 2021 for contribution in Ethics Council activities. I'm really very happy to introduce Mrinalini ma'am and request her to take over the session.
So thank you, ma'am. I'm sharing my slide. So good afternoon to all. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Ganesh Dakle sir and Dr. Kamal sir for this opportunity. And thanks Punagai madam for the kind introduction. I'm talking on serious adverse event and compensation guidelines in India. Covering the topic under the following headings: background of new regulatory guidelines, serious adverse events, compensation guidelines, and compensation formula. We talk of regulations in India. The Drug and Cosmetic Act was enacted in 1940 to regulate the import, manufacture, distribution, and sale of drug, cosmetic, as well as medical devices. And rules were framed under this act in 1945. Schedule Y was introduced in the Drug and Cosmetic Rule in 1988. And presently, it is superseded by the new Drug and Clinical Trial Rule, which was introduced in March 2019. So if we talk about the background of development of the compensation guidelines in India, we all know that clinical research, including clinical trial, is the heart of evidence-based medicine. And in 2004, India was focused as a hub of clinical research, utilizing the advantage India factor, that is availability of large, diverse treatment naive population, trained human resources, GCP compliant sites, and investigators. However, isolated cases of alleged incorrectly conducted clinical trials that were not compliant to the principle of ethics were reported in the year 2005 to 2012 approximately. Taking up this issue, one of the NGOs, Swasthya Adhikar Manch, filed a public interest litigation in Supreme Court of India, and the primary concern was regarding the process of informed consent and justifiable compensation paid to the trial participants. In response to this, Government of India informed that during this period, there were 2868 deaths out of which 89 deaths were related to clinical trial and 86 cases were given compensation. But the amount of compensation that was given ranged from 55,000 to 42 lakhs, very wide range, and this was based on the judgment of ethics committee and sponsors. So the issue was that the assessment of the amount of compensation was not based on any objectively defined guidelines. Hence, the Supreme Court directed government to formulate appropriate regulations and effective oversight mechanism to ensure participants' safety in clinical trial. And finally, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare came up with the 3 landmark amendments, and in the year 2013, and 2013 was a year of amendments. There were many amendments in this year, and these were the amendments. 122 DAB, which was regarding essay reporting and compensation for research-related injury. Then 122 DAC, conditions to be fulfilled by sponsor to conduct clinical research, and 122 DD, which was regarding the registration of ethics committee that was made mandatory with the Central Drug Standard Control Organization since 2013. There were many amendments. There were also amendments regarding the audiovisual recording of the informed consent process. The formula for injury was devised. And finally, in 2019 March, we had this new drug and clinical trial rule. So before going into the topic, let us know some definitions. What is an adverse event? Adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject during treatment with a pharmaceutical product, and which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the treatment being given. So whenever the causality cannot be established between the investigational drug and the event, we call it as an adverse event. Now, when is this adverse event called a serious adverse event? Serious adverse event means an untoward medical occurrence during clinical trial resulting in the following situations: either death, hospitalization of the trial subject where the trial subject is an outdoor patient or a healthy person, prolongation of hospitalization where the trial subject is an indoor patient, permanent disability, significant disability or incapacity, congenital anomaly, birth defect, or life-threatening event. So in these situations, the adverse event is called as a serious adverse event. If we talk on guidelines of compensation, the statement of compensation has been clearly forwarded in the Declaration of Helsinki in 2013, ICGCP guidelines, Indian GCP guideline, and ICMR guideline all mention about the compensation to the trial participants in case of injury during trial or research. Now, what is new drug and clinical trial rule is saying about compensation? NDCT 2019 has a chapter 6 on compensation in case of injury or death during clinical trial. So the compensation in case of injury or death or clinical trial in a bioequivalence study or bioliability study or clinical trial is mentioned in Rule 39 of NDCT 2019, and it mainly talks about clinical trial related injury. And this term is very important. What is clinical trial related injury? I will be talking about this in my subsequent slides. Now let us first see what are the compensation clauses for clinical trial related injury given in NDCT 2019 Rule 39. So this Rule 39 sub-rule 1 says that where any death of a trial subject occurs during clinical trial or BA/BA study, the legal heir of the trial subject shall be provided financial compensation by the sponsor who has obtained permission to conduct the trial or BA/BA study in accordance with the procedure which is specified in Rule 42. Now the second sub-rule is where permanent disability has occurred. So where permanent disability or any other injury occurs to a trial subject during clinical trial or BA/BA study, the trial subject himself is provided or shall be provided financial compensation by the sponsor or its representative who has obtained permission from the CLA in accordance with the procedure specified in Rule 42. Now this financial compensation, as mentioned in sub-rule 1 and 2, shall be along with the expenses incurred on medical management of the trial subject, and in the event of an injury which is not being permanent in nature, the quantum of compensation shall be commensurate with the loss of wages of the subject. So in case of trial related injury, the trial subject shall get financial compensation, and in addition to that, free medical management. Then medical management, what the NDCT 2019 is saying about medical management in case of injuries occurring to the trial participants in a clinical trial or BA study. So according to Rule 14 of NDCT 2019, where an injury occurs to any subject during clinical trial or BA study, the sponsor shall provide free medical management to each subject. Now, how the question is how long this free medical management should be given. So as mentioned in this rule, it is as long as required as per the opinion of the investigator, or till such time it is established that the injury is not related to clinical trial, or whichever is earlier. Now, we will talk on the clinical trial related injury. How do we define it? What are the conditions where the injury occurring in a clinical trial can be called as clinical trial related injury? So this is mentioned in Rule 41. So as per Rule 41 of New Drug and Clinical Trial Rule, the sponsor or his representative, whosoever has obtained the permission for the conduct of the clinical trial, shall provide financial compensation if the injury or death has occurred because of any one of the following reasons. That is, first, if injury or death in the clinical trial has occurred because of the adverse effect of the investigational product, it is called as a trial related injury, and it is liable to be compensated by the sponsor. The second situation is if the injury or death in the trial has occurred because of the violation of approved protocol, scientific misconduct, or negligence by sponsor or representative or the investigator. It will be called as clinical trial related injury, and again it is liable to be compensated by the sponsor. The third situation is adverse effect to a child in utero due to participation of parent in clinical trial. Fourth, any clinical trial procedure involved in the study that is leading to serious adverse event. Fifth, adverse effect due to concomitant medication excluding standard care as necessitated as part of the approved protocol. Sixth situation is not providing the required standard care, though available to the subject as per clinical trial protocol in placebo controlled trial. And a failure of the investigational product to provide intended therapeutic effect where the required standard care or rescue medication, though available, was not provided to the subject as per the clinical trial protocol. So these are the 7 conditions where if the injury or death has occurred because of this, it will be called as clinical trial related injury. And why is it important? It is important because it is liable to be compensated by the sponsor or whosoever has obtained the permission from CL. Now, what is the procedure for compensation in case of injury or death during clinical trial or BA study? So for this, the first step, let us see what are the reporting timelines for this serious adverse event. So the reporting timelines for 2 stakeholders I have taken, investigator and the ethics committee. For investigator, he has to report the serious adverse event within 24 hours of occurrence to Central Licensing Authority, sponsor, and the ethics committee. The investigator, then he has to do the due analysis and submit its final report within 14 days of knowledge of occurrence of the SAE to the ethics committee, the Drug Controller General of India or the Central Licensing Authority, and the head of the institution. What happens if the investigator does not submit the essay in the given timeline? He has to furnish the reason for delay to the licensing authority along with the report of essay. Then the ethics committee. What are the reporting timelines for ethics committee? Ethics committee has 13 calendar days. Within 13 calendar days of receiving the report of essay from the investigator, it has to report it to the Central Licensing Authority or the DCGI, and it has to do the due analysis, and it may also give its opinion on compensation in case of relatedness as per the formula specified in the 7th schedule. Then after this reporting part is done, the reports by the sponsor, investigators, and EC, as I have told you, they reach to the Central Licensing Authority. Now, what is Central Licensing Authority doing? It constitutes an independent expert committee in case of SAE of death. So first we will be talking about the procedure for SAE of death. So the CLA constitutes an independent expert committee. This expert committee makes recommendations to the Central Licensing Authority about the cause of SAE, taking into consideration reports from investigator, sponsor, and ethics committee. Second, it may also recommend quantum of compensation as per the formula in 7th schedule to be paid by the sponsor in case it is a clinical trial related death. Now, once for this, the expert committee has the timeline 60 days from receiving the report of SAE. Now, this expert committee forwards the report to the Central Licensing Authority, which considers the recommendation of the expert committee, determines the cause of death, the quantum of compensation with regard to relatedness, and finally passes the final order regarding the quantum of compensation to be paid by the sponsor within 90 days from the receipt of report of SAE. The sponsor then pays the compensation as specified in the order within 30 days of receipt of order and submits the detail of compensation paid to the Central Licensing Authority. So this is about the final order of SAE of death. Now, what about SAE other than death? The process remains the same, except one difference is there. As the report is forwarded by the investigator EC to the Drug Controller General of India. Now, the DCGI or CLA within 60 days of receipt of report of SAE determines the cause of SAE, gives its opinion regarding the quantum of compensation in case of relatedness. Now, in case of SAE other than death, CLA has an option to constitute expert committee. It may constitute, it may not constitute. Then it passes the order, final order to the sponsor, and the sponsor within 30 days of receipt of order, it submit the details of compensation paid to DCGL. So the only difference is that in case of SAE other than death, the CLA has an option to constitute expert committee. Now, what happens if the compensation is not provided by the sponsor? Here, the Central Licensing Authority or DCGI gives an opportunity to show cause. It may suspend or cancel the clinical trial, may restrict the sponsor or its representative to conduct any further clinical trial in India or take any other action deemed fit. Now, till now we have talked about the clinical trial related injury and death, the compensation clauses. Now, what about medical management and compensation for injury or death, which is relating to biomedical and health research? Now, this is given in Rule 43 of NDCT 2019. So it says that medical management and compensation for injury or death relating to biomedical and health research shall be in accordance with the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants as specified by the Indian Council of Medical Research from time to time. And what is ICMR 2017 guidelines saying about compensation? It says that in case of death, the participants' dependents are entitled to financial compensation, and the research proposal should have an inbuilt provision for mitigating research-related harm. All research participants who suffer harm, whether related or not, should be offered appropriate medical care, psychosocial support, referrals, clinical facilities, etc. Medical management should be free if the harm is related to the research, and compensation should be given to any participants when the injury is related to the research. This is applicable to participants in any of the arms of research, such as intervention, control, or standard of care. So this was about the compensation in cases of clinical trial related injury, as well as compensation in case of biomedical and health research. Now let us have a look to the formulas to determine the quantum of compensation in cases of clinical trial related injury or death, as mentioned in the 7th schedule of New Drug and Clinical Trial Rule 2019. Now, if we talk of quantum of compensation, there are many factors which can affect the compensation, like age, gender, profession, income, dependence, etc. However, to ensure objectivity and applicability in diverse situation, our regulators have incorporated two most important factors, that is age and baseline risk in the formula for calculating compensation. So the final formula for calculating compensation in case of death, it is compensation is equal to B into F into R upon 99.37, where B is the base amount, it is fixed, 8 lakhs. And F is the factor which is depending on the age. So the chart is given where there is a corresponding factor to age, like 16, it is 228.54, or 65, it is 99.37, and so on. And lastly, R is the risk factor for severity or seriousness, which is ranging from 0.5 to 4. Like 0.5 is terminally ill patients where the expected survival is not more than 6 months. 1 is patient with high risk, expected survival 6 to 24 months. 2 is patient with moderate risk, 3 with mild risk, and 4 finally healthy volunteers. So just an example, suppose SAE of death has occurred to a healthy volunteer of age 35 years, which was related. Then putting the factors, like for age 35 years, the factor is this 197.06. And as it is a healthy volunteer, the risk factor will be 4. So putting up the values in the formula, it comes up to 63.45 lakhs. Now we have seen the formula for calculation of compensation in case of SAE of death. Now what about SAE other than death? SAE other than death is based on the assumption that death is the maximum possible injury to an individual, and amount in case of injury has to be less than the amount that would have been applicable in case of death in similar circumstances. So it is very clear that for SAEs other than death, the quantum of compensation would always be less than it would have been for SAE of death. So SAE, we will see the formula in case of SAE which is causing permanent disability to the subject. Now, in case if the disability is 100%, then the schedule 7 schedule is saying that it is 90% of the compensation which would have been due for payment to the nominee in case of death of the subject. And if it is less than 100% disability, it will be proportional to the actual percentage of disability the subject has suffered, like 80 or 70, like that. So the final formula is for disability is D into 90 into C upon 100 into 100. What is D? It is the percentage disability. As I have said, it can be 80% or 70%, so on. And what is C? C is the quantum of compensation which would have been due for payment to the subject in case of death. So we will have to calculate C depending upon the formula B into F into R upon 99.37. Whatever we get the value, we will be putting into it, and we will getting the compensation amount. The third situation is SAE causing congenital anomaly. So following situations may arise due to congenital anomaly or birth defect. Either it can be a stillbirth, or it can be early death due to anomaly. It can be no death, but deformity, which can be fully corrected through appropriate intervention, or it can be a permanent disability. So for the situation A and B where death has occurred, a fixed amount is to be given, that is 4 lakh by the sponsor. So it is fixed, we don't have to calculate. But in the situation C and D, here the sponsor has to give medical management over and above the fixed amount as long as required. That means he has to pay 4 lakh and he has to pay for the medical management till the time the participant is requiring it. The third situation is where the SAE is causing life-threatening disease, or it is an reversible SAE in case it is resolved. Here, the quantum of compensation is linked to the number of days of hospitalization. The compensation per day of hospitalization shall be equal to the wage loss. And how do we calculate wage loss per day? It is equal to the minimum wage of unskilled worker in Delhi. It is taken from the Workman Compensation Act. So the formula is compensation is equal to 2 into N into W. What is N? N is the number of days of hospitalization, and W is the minimum wage per day of unskilled worker in Delhi, which is presently 15,908 rupees per month. So these are the formulas. If we see the calculation, compensation calculations, there are many issues in compensation calculation. As you see, the age, if the age is less, the factor will be more, and hence the compensation will be more. If the age is more, factor will be less, and compensation will be less. Risk factor, it is subjective. So all the stakeholders may have a different opinion regarding the risk factor. So causality assessment, as defined, it is the evaluation of likelihood that a particular drug is the cause of an observed event. And so it is always one drug versus one event. Why is it very important? Because in Indian context, it has an extra dimension, that is compensation. So we should be very particular about the causality assessment. There are many complexities as far as this causality is concerned. It is done by many stakeholders for the same case, like investigator is doing the causality assessment. Then it comes to the ethics committee sponsor and the expert committee. Each expert has their own assessment. In Indian context, as I have told you, it is related to compensation. So the question is how to decide relatedness with maximum objectivity. Finally, coming to the conclusion, several regulations regarding compensation for clinical trial related injury or death have been introduced to ensure that participants' interest is safeguarded in clinical trials in India. The regulatory guidelines are a part of a dynamic process and will continue evolving as per the changing requirements and demands of the system. These regulations should be clearly understood and followed correctly by all the stakeholders. So thank you. Slide show.
That was very nice, crisp, and excellent presentation, Dr. Mrinalini. Actually, you covered everything in a crisp manner, like what is SAE and the types of SAE and all those procedures which has to be done, and timelines of reporting of the SAE, and also the compensation formulas and the factors, how to calculate all those things, and also the causality assessment. That was very crisp and informative for all of us. And I have a few questions.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This has been asked in various forums, but yet I want to just ask this question for the sake of the participants. The related to the academic trial. Since we are all working in academic institutions, so in the academic trials, which is needed for the dissertations of postgraduates, and all. So if something SAE happens of different varied types, so what is NDCT telling about this?
Yes.
And what can be done for this?
Yes, NDCT has very clearly mentioned in Rule 42 that whatever thesis and dissertation and other research that we are doing in academic institution, it comes under biomedical and health research. And NDCT Rule 42, it says that the compensation guidelines for biomedical and health research, it should be followed according to whatever is mentioned in the ICMR guidelines 2017. So the compensation clauses what are given in ICMR guidelines 2017, that should be followed for biomedical and health research, like whatever thesis we are doing or academic research we are doing. So it is almost the same as for clinical trials. However, there are no formulas. And here the institution, it becomes the sponsor. Even Thatya madam in her presentation has covered this point. The institution becomes the sponsor, and in cases of related injury, it becomes a responsibility of the institutions to pay for the trial related injury or any harm or death that has occurred. And the quantum of compensation to be decided, the responsibility has been given on the EC by ICMR guide.
So it's up to the institution to pay or make a corpus fund or
Yes,
something
so
like that.
institution should have some, they should make some
mechanism.
arrangement for provision, or they should have corpus fund for such.
Thank you very much. And this loss of wages. So how it is calculated? Like for the reversible SAE, we have this the unskilled laborers, that 15,000 amount which you mentioned. Can it be included for all the calculating all the loss of wages, or daily wages calculations in
Yes,
other.
it is to be used for calculating the loss of wages, and it keeps on changing, isn't it? So recently,
Yes.
this loss of wage was still changed. It is for the unskilled worker in Delhi. We have taken the loss of wage from the unskilled worker in Delhi, depending upon the Workmen Compensation Act. Why it was taken? Because it is highest in Delhi. So it is given per month, like 15,908. It was recently changed in April 21, and it is per month. So accordingly, you have to calculate for 26 days, because there are 4 Sundays, and accordingly you can calculate it depending upon the number of days of hospitalization. Suppose the patient participant is admitted for 10 days, then accordingly you have to multiply it.
And that F factor you mentioned, so how it came into in the formula and how it is
Yes,
calculated, why it
yes,
is
it
calculated?
was very our regulators, it was very difficult for our regulators to come to a
Yes.
conclusion for deriving a problem formula for quantum of compensation. So as I have told you, to ensure maximum objectivity, they have taken age and baseline risk. So the F factor, that is A slack, it is fixed amount. It is again derived from the workman compensation, the law workman compensation, and it was decided why to take 8 lakhs. It was like, if this amount is kept as a fixed deposit in account of the participants, the interest that will be derived per month will be equivalent to the minimum wage loss of unskilled worker in Delhi per day. So accordingly, that 8 lakh was taken. And it will be changing, like if the Workman Compensation Act changes, this may change, but presently it is 8 lakh.
And also the highlights of this NDCT 2019 from the previous ones, what are the highlights of the changes in compensation
Yes,
and ACE?
yes, ma'am. Our next speaker is talking on this, so I will not be
Yeah.
taking time on it. Yeah.
So I have a question also from the
Chat
delegate.
box.
Yeah. If the subject dies during the clinical trial and becoming very difficult to find the relatedness, in such cases, how to decide compensation?
Yes.
It's a
So
question asked by
unless,
Dr. Praveen.
yes, Dr. Praveen, what we do is that, as I've told you, relatedness is very important for financial compensation. In a clinical trial, if it is related, then only it is liable to compensation. If you cannot decide the compensation, what NDCT is saying, the sponsor has to give free medical management, and the duration till such time it is established as per the opinion of the investigator, or till such time the causality establishment is done. Okay, so free medical management is to be given by the sponsor until the time the relatedness is not established. It is not liable to financial compensation until the relatedness is there. If it is related, then only it is liable to be compensated. So relatedness is very important. I hope I am clear.
Yeah, I think so. But there are no more questions in the chat box, sir.
One more question in chat box. What is the minimum amount of compensation in case of death due to ACE?
Yeah,
Yes. So the minimum amount, because of the time constraint, I have not included this point. It is 2 lakhs. If the expected mortality is in 1 month is 90%, then it is 2 lakhs. So minimum is 2 lakhs and maximum is up to 74 lakhs.
and one more question which I wanted to ask: this travel-related injuries. During follow-up visits and all for clinical trials, the participant undergoes any trauma or injury during the traveling to the hospital or way back home. So what happens during that time? So whether that injury will be included in this compensation or
Yes, if the trial part, if the participant is in clinical trial and during his participation in the clinical trial, he has undergone that accident. But if it is not related, it will not be compensated. But pre-medical management is to be given to the participant by the sponsor.
thank you very much, Dr. Mrinalini.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, madam. Now I request Dr. Chetna Desai, madam, to introduce the second speaker, Dr. Sukanta Sen. Over to Dr. Chetna, madam. Chetna madam, unmute yourself.
Dr. Sukant, I would like to first share the screen. Yeah, please.
Sorry.
Okay. All right. Is it visible?
Yes, madam.
Great. A very good afternoon to all of you. I see there are more than 185 and 190 participants, which is quite a huge number, and all the credit goes to the organizers and especially Dr. Dakle and the NPT, as well as, of course, Dr. Thatte Madam, without whose guidance she adds a special flavor to these type of programs. We call it an academic flavor. The next speaker and yes, I would like to thank all of you for this privilege to introduce Dr. Sukant Sen, who is presently working as Professor and Head of Pharmacology and Dean of Students Affairs at ICARE Institute of Medical Sciences and Research in West Bengal. He's been awarded the gold medal from the West Bengal University of Health Sciences, Kolkata, for securing highest marks in DM exams in 2015. He has a very impressive collection of publications, more than 125 publications. He's a certified NABH assessor for accreditation of clinical trial sites, ethics committee, and investigator, GCP trained and certified. So he quite a appropriate person for topics such as this. And he has been trained with NMC faculty development program in MET, like the revised basic course workshop, ADCOM module, CISP, and advanced course in medical education training. He is going to talk about the new clinical drug and drug trials rules that were notified in 2019 by the Minister of Health and Family Welfare under the aegis of the Drugs and Cosmetic Act of 1940. And we all know that they came in force from the date of publication, that was 19th March of 2019, excepting the Chapter 4, which came in force after 180 days. That Chapter 4 was for EC, for the biomedical and health research. All of these we know by now know that apply to all the new drugs, the investigational new drugs for human use, clinical trials, BE studies, BA studies, and for the ethics committee. It's nearly a 250 plus page document published both in Hindi and in English, just like other gazette notifications of the government of India. But we see that this document, ever since it has been published, has had several positive implications in the way the clinical trials are conducted, especially in relation to compensation and increasing, the benchmarks and standards of clinical trials in the country. So, without much ado, I would like to hand over this forum to Dr. Sukant Sen. Welcome, Dr. Sen. I will stop my screen sharing so that do it. All right.
Yes, ma'am. Now, is it visible, ma'am?
Yes, Dr.
Yes,
Sen,
yes.
we are able to see your slides. Maybe you can go in the power show, this
Slideshow.
full screen. Yeah, slide show.
It's in slideshow, ma'am. Okay. Thank you, ma'am, for a nice introduction. And I'm very much thankful to NPTs, especially Professor Dhakle sir and Professor CM Kamal, for giving me this opportunity to basically to be part of this August gathering. So my task has been simplified because we had already discuss several issues related to NDCT. So my thing is to summarize what are the important aspects of NDCT 2019. So going into the details, Madam already spoken the and it city 2019 when it is come up. We all know in the March 19, 2029, this NDCT came into force, except for the chapter 4, which is related to biomedical health research, which came into picture on after 180 days, means September 2019. This has been developed and this modification done with Drugs Technical Advisory Board, which is under Ministry of Health. So what are the important components of NDCT? So if you go through this, Madam is already spoken the number of pages. It is almost 118 pages if you go through the English document. So in these 118 pages, there are almost 13 chapters and there are 8 schedules. Other than these 13 chapters and 8 schedules, there are clinical trial forms, which is of 27 in number, start from 1 to 27. This is related to different activities.
Sukanta sir, just a minute. Slide is not changing.
It's not moving?
Not moving.
Okay. Can stop sharing.
Yes, yes, you can go ahead another.
Can you put it in the slideshow mode, please?
Now, ma'am.
Can you put it in the slideshow mode? Slideshow.
Is it now visible?
It is visible, but it's not in the slideshow mode. If you can do it. There's an icon at the bottom. Yeah.
Yeah.
This
The slides are moving. The slides are moving. Yeah. Okay.
Now it's okay, ma'am.
Yes, they are not in the slideshow mode. That's all. Otherwise, they seem to be okay.
From my
They are
system,
moving now.
It's now in my system. It is slideshow, ma'am.
Okay, there's some issue. Chalo, it doesn't matter.
Now you are saying content of NDCT.
Yes, content is moving now.
Okay.
Content is moving.
So there are 13 chapters. The first chapter related to different definitions. There are some modification with the already existing definition. Second chapter related to authorities and officers who are assigned.
So, Dr. Sen, you need to move your slide next one. We're talking of contents, right? Contents is the next slide. Right now, we are reading the NCDT rules have come in force since March 19, 2019. That was the earlier slide. Slide number 2. We are seeing slide number 2.
Now 3.
Dr. Sen, can you first try to switch on the slideshow view?
Yes, sir. I just.
Because otherwise, we see a lot of editing
But
on the slides.
he is saying it in the slideshow mode, but we are not able to see it, is what he's saying.
Use the top button, slideshow. So when you share, the first screen which comes, there's a 2 options where you have to take, maybe that might solve. Yeah, just sir, when you share, click on the share screen, the first pop-up window which you say, there's a tick mark, share audio, share video. Please tick on that and then share.
Now you are seeing, sir, my slide.
But not in the slideshow view, sir.
To proceed,
Sir,
provided he is able to move the
yeah.
slides. It's okay.
Sir, on your desktop, you close this slides. Close these slides.
Okay.
Reopen them. Unshare. Yes. Now, sir, reopen. Put into slideshow view. Then go to shares. So, sir, open. We get same view.
Is it moving, sir?
No, we are
No,
seeing
same
your
issue.
title slide. We are seeing your title slide. Dr. Dakle, would you have his copy? Then maybe you can do it on his
Dr.
behalf.
Sukanta, just unshare. Stop screen sharing. Let's go step by step. Please stop sharing. Okay, now click on share screen, just one click. On your desktop, you will see now a pop-up window. There are two options below which says share audio, share video for screen optimization. Click on them. This will be the last panel on the bottom.
Yes, sir.
Once you checked on that, then you select your PPT which you want to share. Or you can share with the Dr. Chetna or Dr. Ganesh. No, I think. Do you have a lot of other files opened on your desktop? Please close them.
Nothing, sir. Only Gmail account.
Can you send the PPT to us?
Already,
We'll try to do from our end.
already shared, ma'am.
Already shared with whom?
Sukanta Sen, you can close it. I will try.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, okay.
You can go ahead now then.
Okay, next, sir. Next slide. So we have already discussed when the NDCT come into force in March 2019. Next slide, please. In NDCT, there are 13 chapters and there are 8 schedule. Other than this, we have already discussed there are clinical trial form 1 to 27. So one slide back. So chapter 1, they basically look after the definition. Chapter 2, who are the authorities. Chapter 3, which is very important, ethics committee, how for the clinical trial and BAV studies, what are the rules, regulations. And the chapter 4, this is the ethics committee for biomedical research. Chapter 5, which is related to clinical trial BA studies of new and investigation new drug. Chapter 6, which we have already taught by Dr. The previous speaker, this compensation. Next, sir. The chapter 7, how to operate and run a BAVs and study centers. What are the rules, regulation related to that? Chapter 8, with this manufacturing of new drugs and or investigation new drugs for related to CTB, or study, either for study or doing some examination, test and analysis. Chapter 9 is basically import of new drugs or IND related to CT or BA or BAV studies. And chapter 10 basically import or manufacturers of new drugs for sale and distribution. Next slide, please. Chapter 11, which is very important. This is for import or manufacture on unapproved new drugs for the treatment of patient in government hospitals or medical colleges. Chapter 12, that is nothing significant, that the amendments are the only few points that have been added. And chapter 13 is miscellaneous. First schedule, which is related to the general principle of CT, Second schedule, which is related to requirement and guidelines related to new drugs to undertake clinical trials. And the third schedule is conduct of clinical trial in India. Next slide, please. The fourth schedule related to BA/BE study. Fifth schedule is very important for the industry people for post-marketing assessment. What are the procedure? How they can do it. Sixth schedule, basically different type of fees and the procedure of permission taking these activities. Seventh schedule, Madam has already discussed. This is the quantum of compensation. And eighth schedule, there are different type of applications and form. Next slide, please. So chapter 1, which is very important things, all these NDCT rules, they are basically related to new drugs, IND for human use, doing clinical trial, BAV studies. And the next two important things are ethics committee related, which is related to CE or BAV study, and the biomedical health research. In chapter 1, the definition, there are lots of definition, but only few definitions are important, which have been modified. The definition of new drugs. In new drugs definitions, they have incorporated two things, words. One is the novel drug delivery systems, even living modified organisms. So they have been incorporated in the new drugs definitions. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss the new drug definition because it has been discussed several times. So there are 5 components in the definition of new drugs as per NDCT. If you go through the 4th and 5th one, so this is they have incorporated the modified and sustained release and the vaccine or the living modified organisms. Why this definition and these points are important? First 1 to 3 points, when you go for a new drugs life, it is almost of 4 years as per the rules and regulation. But for 5th and 6th, this NDCT has mentioned. Next slide, please. So if the drugs category falls into the subclass of 4 and 5, so they shall be deemed to be a new class for a longer period. Next slide, please. So there are different definitions in these documents. So I have highlighted 2 definitions. One is academic clinical trial and biomedical health research. Other than these, there are 2 more definitions. One is orphan drugs and second is similar biologics. The rest of the definition is almost same as the previous documents. Next slide, please. In academic clinical trial, we have already discussed, so I'm not going into the details. So basically what is, whenever you are doing some academic research which is related to some new indication, new routes of administration or doses form, and you have taken approval from the ethics committee and you are not going to submit this information to the outcome of this study to the central licensing authority, and you are not doing this for promotional purpose except for the scientific purpose or publications, so they will be called as a academic clinical trial. And this is the technical definition which I have taken from NDCT. Next slide, please. The academic clinical trials, which we have already discussed, this should be done by approved clinical trial protocol and everything mentioned in National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Health Research involving human participants, which is basically uploaded by ICH. In academic clinical trial, there are certain protocols, there are overlapping between academic city and the actual city. If the ethics committee feels there are some doubts, so they can write to central licensing authority within 30 days of their receiving application and for any kind of clarification in writing. If the central licensing authority, they are not sending or they are not communicating, so it is presumed that this is not related to clinical trial. This is a purely academic clinical trial, so we can go ahead. Next slide, please. So in Indian condition, orphan drug definition is if the disease condition or prevalence is less than 5 lakhs in Indian population, so they can be called as orphan drugs. And the similar biological definition, there are certain components have been modified. Next slide, please. The chapter 2, it is the drug controller of India who has the nodal entity has been assigned by the central government under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. He has the every power for giving licensing and approval as per these rules. But he has given option for delegation of power. But the drugs controller of India can delegate this power after getting written permission from the central government basically from Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And this has been mentioned, the rank of this officer should not be less than Assistant Drugs Controller of India. Next slide, please. So what are the important things in the chapter 3, which is related to ethics committee of CT and DAB study? So ethics committee means for two purposes according to these rules. One is ethics committee for clinical trial and second is biomedical research. There are two chapters, chapter 3 and 4, which is dedicatedly given NDCT for ethics committee. And they have categorically mentioned there are two ethics governing systems, two different ethics committee, and they have to approach for registration monitoring in two different authorities under Government of India. Next slide, please. So I'm not repeating these things. The chapter 3 and chapter 4 dedicatedly for different type of ethics committee. And there are 3 schedules which are dealing with ethics committee activities. One is 3rd schedule, 7th schedule, which madam has already discussed, and the 8th schedule, which is related to different type of forms. Next. Now, registration of ethics committees, there are the dedicated form is CT1. So once you completely fulfill this, the form, and this has been thoroughly checked by the Central Licensing Authority, so they can grant us the permission or registration for 5 years, which is initially for 3 years, but then after this document, they have extended this period up to 5 years. In case there is any modification or there is a chances of rejection, so the Central Licensing Authority has to communicate the applying ethics committee. So in writing, what are the changes or modifications required. After 5 years of completion of this registration process, at least 90 days before, we have to reapply for re-registration of institution ethics committee. Next. There are 12 different type of documents which is categorically mentioned in the NDCT, which have to be kept in the ethics committee procedure. So I'm not discussing all these points. This is already given in NDCT. There are 12 different documents, the type of documents which shall be kept in the ethics process. Next, please. Next. So constitution of ethics committee. The 1 month back, we are discussing this component with Professor Dakle sir and Dr. CM Kaman. In this NDCT, they have categorically mentioned all the ethics committee people, they should be trained with the GCP and more emphasis on the rules and regulation and updates of NDCT. So then Professor Dakle has included this component, this GCP, which is very much important. Whenever you apply for registration of ethics committee, if your training doesn't include this NDCT discussion, so they may ask for repetition of this training program. In this document, they have mentioned if you can disqualify a member if it doesn't have the training related to NDCT and the GCP. And one important thing, this document, all the members, basically medical scientists and clinicians, they should have at least post-graduation degree respective to their discipline. Next, please. Functioning of ethics committee, this has been discussed. Only one thing is important whenever we are analyzing any adverse event. So there is a dedicated chapter 4 which we have to follow when we are forwarding this information to Central Licensing Authority. More important, whenever there is a irregularities in the function of CTs or irregularities in the function of ethics committee, so Central Licensing Authority has the capacity to inspect the premises of ethics committee, even the clinical trial site, without taking any prior notice. And next important things, the maintenance of record of ethics committee. So in this document, they have categorically mentioned we have to keep this document, data, record, register, whatever related to ethics committee, at least for 5 years, because this is a era of consumerism and for the best safety or support of the trial participant. Next, please. Next, chapter 4, which is related to biomedical health research. This is a very interesting thing. I personally feel this is an innovative idea from ICMR because there are lots of burden to the institutional ethics committee who are dealing with both the clinical trial project and the biomedical research project. So this registration process of biomedical health research, they should follow the national ethics guideline, which we have already discussed, and their authority is under Director of Health Research. There is a dedicated the portal which is called naitik.gov.in. Whereas for registration of ethics committee, which is looking after BEB study or clinical trial, they have to approach the Sugam portal. Next, please. So Department of under Health Research, they facilitate this kind of activity of biomedical research. The form is same, that's CT1. So initially they have to give provisional registration for 2 years. Once they find out everything is okay, the registration process for 5 years. Next, please. So now chapter 5, which is related to clinical trial and BAV studies of new drugs and investigation and new drugs. What are the important things? It is the ethics committee should go through all the activities of clinical trials activity before initiation and throughout the clinical trial process. So they are basically the checking system. What are the good points of clinical trials happening in India? So for permission of clinical trial for any new drugs or IND, there's a dedicated form called CT4. And if you are doing some clinical research in government setup, there is no fees applicable. Whereas private sponsor, there are dedicated fees for every activities. For grant of permission of any clinical trial activities, there is a dedicated form which is called CT6. Next slide, please. In case, this is very important, this is a new inclusion in this NDCD, and the drug is discovered in India, or else research and development is done in India. And third important, we have proposed to manufacture and market this drug in India. That application shall be disposed within 30 days of online submission of receipt through Sugam. This is a very time-bound process. There is no communication if you are not receiving from the central licensing authority. So it is being, it is saying that this has been granted. Or else rest of the cases, suppose the drug is already approved in other countries, the application should be disposed within 90 days. So it is a drug of India origin or specially developed in India. So that case, we have to do all the process, complete this process by 90 days. Next important thing, the ethics committee, which is looking after. Suppose the hospital doesn't have an ethics committee. So he can have a memorandum understanding with the ethics committee nearby. And they have categorically mentioned the ethics committee should not be 50 kilometers from the clinical trial site. Suppose I have applied a clinic documents or submitted my clinical trial project protocol to ethics committee. They have rejected it with certain information that these are the level. So as an investigator or as a sponsor, we have to communicate the central licensing authority first before applying to the next ethics committee. Next slide, please. Central licensing authority shall be informed the approval of ethics committee within 15 days of grant of approval. We all know whenever we are doing any clinical research or clinical trial, that should be registered with CTR. So status of enrollment of study subjects that should be submitted through online basis quarterly, and they have designated format available in the site. Next slide, please. 6 monthly status report of clinical trials should be submitted electronically to the Sugam portal. Previously, we are doing offline mode. Now everything is online mode. In case of termination of any clinical trial site because of serious adverse reaction, which have higher incidence, so that should be communicated to the central licensing authority within 13 working days of termination. So validity of this permission of clinical trial for 2 years, and certain cases, exceptional cases, can be extended for 1 year. Next slide, please. So post-trial access of investigation new drugs and new drugs. This is a very interesting subject and very debatable issue. So how much post-trial access to be given to the study participants? So after completion of clinical trial to any trial subject, in this NDCT categorically mentioned, the post-trial access should be provided to the sponsor, such as clinical trial participant free of cost. So they have mentioned when they'll get this free treatment. If the CT is being conducted for a new indication where there is no alternative good therapy, there is no IND or ND available, and the drug which is done clinical trial, they found very beneficial as per the investigating. Next slide, please. And the trial subject or his legal heir, they have already consented for post-trial access. So they are basically, they will get this post-trial access of that. Otherwise, if they are not given in writing, and that is the sponsor has no liability to give post-trial access of IND and new drugs. So there is a scope of ethics committee and the investigator to communicate sponsor, to convince sponsor for having post-trial access of different drugs. Next, coming to the application of permission to conduct bioavailability and bioequivalence study. So there is a dedicated form which is called CT5, and if you are giving permission, so the form is CT9. Suppose if you are not satisfied with the application and you are giving writing, so that should be communicated to the viability center within 90 days of working, receiving this application, and the validity of this viability study should be of 1 year. In some cases, it can be extended for another 1 year based on the necessity or requirement. Next, please. Now, chapter 6 related to compensation. I'm not going to into the details because this has been already discussed by the previous speaker. Now, chapter 7, this is related to BA study center. There is a dedicated form for applying registration of CT, that is CT 8. There is a provision for inspection of viability and bioequivalence study center. If they are satisfied, they are giving grant of registration in the dedicated form CT09. And validity of registration of this BAB center, this is valid at least for 5 years. And after that, due course of time, you will have to renew the registration process. And this document of NDCT, they are dedicated 14 points. They have mentioned what are the rules and regulations for activities of bioavailability and bioequivalence study center. Next, please. Next, related to chapter 8, that is manufacture of new drugs and IND related to CT, BAB studies examination. There are dedicated forms, form CT 10, and they are giving the validity of this approval is for 3 years in certain cases, which can be extended for 1 year. Next, please. Application for permission of manufacturing unapproved active pharmaceutical ingredients. This is a very interesting thing. So there are two dedicated forms. One is form CT12, and for active pharmaceutical ingredient, that is form CT13. So this provision of giving approval and granting approval for 3 years, and that is a dedicated form in CT14 and 15. That is basically for the industry people and the central licensing authority, and that can be extended for 1 year for certain cases if you the applicant are requesting for extension. Next, please. So in these new documents, so they have categorically mentioned you have to dispose all the application within 90 working days, and there is a process of accelerated approval. There is a expedited review process, and there has been the animal toxicity studies data and the design and planning almost same which is available previously. Next, please. Next, chapter 10, which is import of new drugs or investigation new drugs related to CT and BAB studies for examination, test, and analysis. There is a dedicated form which is CT16, and granting of that's license valid up to 3 years. Next slide, please. Next, chapter 10, which is related to import and manufacture of new drugs related to sale and distribution. So there are same form is available, that is CT 18, and in case of unapproved new molecule, which is been of national interest, and this has been clinical trial or not being done. So that has been mentioned, you have to include local clinical data, specifically which is mentioned in the second schedule. Next slide, please. So local clinical trial, which has been mentioned in this NDCT, wherever a new drug which is already permitted for certain claims is now proposed to be marketed for any person for new claims, new indication or new doses form, or a new routes of administration or strength. So application form CT shall accompany all the data, the clinical data, everything, but one thing important, that is the results of local clinical data, which is specified in second schedule, should be incorporated. Next. So there are certain conditions where local clinical data can be waived off. I'm not going into the details, but 1, 2, 3 points are important. Suppose the drug is useful for Indian condition, and we have applied for global clinical trial, including India. And meantime, the drugs has been already approved and marketed in the country specified. So in that case, local clinical data can be waived. There is no probability of evidence of severe adverse drug reactions or genetic, pharmacokinetic, or pharmacogenomic abnormalities in the patient. So that can be waived. Even the sponsor has written the CLA, so they are going to conduct phase 4 clinical trial to establish safety and efficacy in Indian patient. So in that case, they can be given relaxation. And most important things, if it is a drug for the treatment for life-threatening disease, which is including tuberculosis, hepatitis C, dengue, malaria, HIV, and even I
Dr.
can say.
Sen, could we ask you to wrap up in the next
Yes,
5
yes,
minutes?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Next slide, please. Next slide. In chapter 9, this import of manufactured unapproved drugs, which we are doing in government setup, medical officer directly apply to the CLA for having license for these drugs, and that is valid for 3 years. For applying this, we have to pay for 5,000 rupees. So in this NDCT, there are separate schedule for different component. For example, compensation, clinical trial, and the GCP. We are not going into detail. So this is the very important aspect of this NDCT. Next slide, please. This pre and post submission, which is also very important. This is just one slide before. To improve transparency, accountability, and predictability of these activities. So there is the scope for pre-submission meeting and the post-submission meeting. So pre-submission meeting, we have to pay, the sponsor have to pay 50,000 rupees, and the post-submission meeting, sponsor have to pay 15,000 rupees. So within 15 days, their query has been addressed. So this is the one of the very important aspects, so that they can proceed these activities faster. So in this NDCT, they have categorically mentioned there are different expert committee group for different activities. And one thing they have categorically mentioned, that is they may that is the scope for development of applicant. If there is a scope and they find out that documents which is submitted, they are fake. So that's are the important points related to NDCT. But every lines of NDCT is very much important. We have to keep on discuss those things for pharmacologist point of view and industry point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. And that was quite an exhaustive narrative of the
Exactly.
yes of the rules. And several of these rules have been quite handy when we are actually trying to, when we are reviewing the protocols for the clinical trials. And we do have a couple of questions here.
Yes,
one question that comes from Amrita Sil to everyone is that how long is a GCP certificate valid? And if the training is online, how long is the GCP certificate valid?
Ma'am, if you go through the NDCT rules, they have not mentioned the validity of, but we go through the documents of ICMR ethics guideline.
Right.
So they have categorically mentioned it is applicable at least for 5 years. So this is valid for 5 years.
The GCP certificate.
Yeah. And second, there is no documents available, this validity regarding the online and the offline mode. Only thing is important, what components you are discussing, this online module or the offline module.
Correct.
Because ultimately this certificate has to be submitted in the CLA, and they have to go through these documents.
But while working for the ethics committee, it is also recommended that even though you may have a GCP certificate, it is always desirable to keep your members updated about whatever developments that have taken through periodic meetings.
Yes, yes,
so most of the times we look only for the certificate, but the idea is to keep yourself updated also. There's one more question, Dr. Sen, is how long should the CT documents be archived by the investigator and the sponsor? Clinical trial documents. The question regarding archival.
Dr. Dakle, I think, sir, 5 years.
If it is clinical trial and once it is over, it should be archived for 5 years. If
5
it is
years
a clinical
after the
trial.
completion of the trial.
Yes, yes. And if it is a ICMR related academic trial, it is for 3 years.
3 years. That is
Yes,
after the completion of the
yes, madam. After completion
trial.
of the trial.
Of the trial. Do we have any websites to update ourselves about the changes occurring in relation to this? Dr. Sen, would you like to respond to this query?
Do you have any website to
Website.
update ourselves?
So normally we keep looking at the CDESCO
Only we go through
website.
CDSO site, ma'am.
Yeah. They keep
And
Recent
even-
notifications.
notifications issued.
And one more suggestion to our NPT, we can
Yes.
provide this, our domain, we can use our domain.
Yeah, so we'll have one more forum where,
Forum.
so Dr. Kamal's work has increased. Yes, that's a very good suggestion, Dr. Sen, that whatever notifications come, they can be shared on this. Usually they are shared, but yes, definitely, that's a good suggestion. Do we have any other questions? Whether non-medical profession, non-affiliated members like layperson, social scientists, and lawyer also need GCP certification for inclusion in ethics committee? Dr. Sen?
Yes, ma'am.
This question
All
is from
the
Nirmalaya.
members of ethics committee, they should have a
Need to
basic
be
knowledge of GCP and all the rules and regulations. And
Not only the
layperson-
members of EC, but also the PIs and co-PIs who want to conduct the clinical trials.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
They
ma'am.
also need the GCP.
Even I personally feel even the administrator of the hospital, they should have a knowledge of.
Yeah,
this.
that is the recommendation, but this is a mandate, I think so.
Yes.
Right. So then we have some nice, nice kudos to the team and to you, sir, saying that this has been an excellent session. And overall, the whole program has been very good. That is what we're finding. Thank you, organizers, for the excellent sessions. So I guess if there are no other questions, we can call it a day with the permission of Dr. Dakle. Dr. Dakle, would you like to
Yes,
say
madam.
something?
Okay. Now we are at the end of our session. I am very thankful to both the speakers for their excellent presentation as well as moderators for their nice moderation. Lastly, my sincere thanks to all participants for their active participation throughout the workshop. My special thanks goes to Dr. Kamal sir, who was instrumental for success of this workshop. Sir has put their wholehearted efforts for this workshop and played a very active role and showed deep involvement since the inception of this workshop, and most of the work is done by Dr. Kamal sir. So please give him a big round of applause for the sir. I also must mention the deep sense of appreciation for one person who worked day and night throughout without any undue interest and without whom we cannot imagine this workshop, and he is none other than Dr. Badial sir, who was the base of the workshop and provided all infrastructure for the workshop. We really proud of you sir. I request all of you to give the big round of applause for the Badial sir also. Lastly, once again, thank you all to make this online workshop grand success and memorable one. With this, I declare that today's workshop of 4 session is over. Thank you all. Thank you, madam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganesh. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.